If the minister fails at that, they should send him packing. Minister of Finance who woke up and realized that budget cuts kill people. The kind of contestation which we've witnessed around the budget is actually a good thing. And the real villain of this sort of budget saga, both substantively and procedurally, isn't the DA or like this party or that party. It's National Treasury.
Spread the fire. Welcome back to SMWX. And today I'm very excited to be joined by economist Gilaad Isaacs. He's the executive director at the Institute for Economic Justice and a very observant critic on South Africa's economy. Gilaad, so nice to have you here.
Afternoon. Thanks very much, Cesar.
Yep, I've cited your work very much. You're one of those interesting economists who's really cutting against the mainstream grain in our country. What did you make of all this budget delay, change, upheaval that we've been through as we build up to Budget 3.0?
I think what we've seen is the fiercest contestation on economic policy, really, that we've had probably since the implementation of a national minimum wage in 2015, 16, 17, and the NDP in 2010, 2011. And it's really brought into sharp highlight the various camps and differing views. And to me, it's revealed why it is that we're still in the economic malaise which we're in. Not so much what the underlying root causes are, because the root causes are structural, but really why policy has failed to get us out of there. If we start with those root causes, right, and we think about what do we mean when we say those root causes are structural? Well, as you know, South Africa simply doesn't make it enough goods and services in the industries which we should be. That means there's not enough economic activity and opportunity, and that's because of the way in which finance, trade policy, industrial policy, fiscal policy for like 100 years was orientated around mining-linked heavy industry, certain service sectors, and finance, right? So there's a like structural architecture of the economy which doesn't have, which the budget is not sort of responsible for, right? Okay, but the budget can be a tool to alter that, right? And that's why I think that what we've seen is really revealing. Because what we have, if we go back a little bit to February, is a Minister of Finance who woke up and realized that budget cuts kill people, right? And the sort of breaking point, I'm told by those closer to him, were also linked to the soldiers being killed in the DRC and the accusation that we've underfunded these people, putting their life on the line. And it was a stark reminder that the last decade of budget cuts actually has consequences, right? And so to his credit, he decided that we should move away from that. And he came out and said, I don't think austerity's helped with our debt levels, and it's undermined services in these ways. And therefore, he implemented in the first budget the first real increases in, as sort of modest as they were, right, in crucial social services that we've seen, except for a brief COVID type of stimulus. Of course, he wanted to fund that with the VAT increase, which I'm critical of and don't think that's the appropriate choice. But it was an important break. And it's an important break with the National Treasury orthodoxy, right? Which is the danger which we face now, that orthodoxy will reassert itself. And that orthodoxy essentially sees that it essentially views the like state not as part of the solution but as part of the problem, right? So on fiscal policy, our borrowing, it competes for financial resources with the private sector, therefore it raises borrowing costs, so we should borrow less, right? On our tax, it's a distortion to the economy and it sucks money out of everybody's pockets, businesses and households, so we should tax less. And our spending is, an okay last resort, but really we should be, trying to spend as little as we can and let the private sector do as much as we can, right? That's the prevailing ideological discourse within National Treasury, right?
What do you think is wrong with that discourse?
I think that, I think it relies on it relies on two things. It relies on, in the popular mind, the argument that the state's broken, right? And we can't trust the state. And, in certain ways, fair enough, right? Okay, right? Like there's very real implementation issues in the state. And then it also relies on these sort of very abstract economic models which economic theory puts forward of these rational individuals optimizing economic outcomes through each individually pursuing their own individual benefit, right? Yeah. And that's just not how the economy works fundamentally, right? Those sort of like stories are precisely that, just stories. And so what it does is remove the transformative role which the state plays. So yes, market economies are pretty good at allocating resources for pretty basic things, right? You want a nice chair, you want a microphone, you want these things. You don't need a state actor to instruct you of where you go purchase that, right? The free market's quite a good mediator of those basic sorts of goods and services, right? But if you want to fundamentally transform the structure of your economy, and that's why I started by saying I think the problems are structural, because what all policy should be orientated towards is transforming that structure, right? Then you need the state. You need coordinated action, right? That's the history of capitalist economic development worldwide, right? Whether in early advanced economies like the UK and elsewhere, it was empire that provided a source of cheap goods or of dedicated export markets.
Sure, even coordination in a way.
Right. Whether more recently in East Asia, it's the state which is allocating credit, but where you have epochal transformations, where what you're really trying to do is restructure your economy, that has to be guided, right? And guided by and the state's the only entity which can do that, right? And therefore, sure, there are moments in which debt might have those consequences, in which you might overtax or any of those things, but you have to see those fiscal policy tools as part of the arsenal which the state has to gather and then strategically allocate resources towards structurally transforming the economy. And the irony is that the department tasked with budgetary expenditures, the department who least believes in the transformative role of the state, right? Yeah. And the real villain of this sort of budget saga, both substantively and procedurally, isn't the DA or this party or that party. It's National Treasury.
That's quite interesting. And just on that, it's been fascinating to me to watch the discourse between Treasury and the ANC itself. Because I suppose the obvious assumption would be, well, the ANC deploys someone to Treasury and they therefore have leverage over that person. But what does seem to have happened, and what has been placed in stark relief, is that in some ways the Treasury acts, if not autonomously, semi-autonomously, and the ANC doesn't seem to itself have full control over the direction of Treasury.
And ironically, if you watch that, a press conference with the various parties who are arguing for the VAT scrapping, Zongezo Zibi from Rise Mzansi puts forward what you've just said, but extols it as a virtue, right? That the National Treasury should somehow have this independence and autonomy, which of course, I think is just madness, right? It's an arm of the state like any other, and should be subject to centralized states coordination and coherence. So I think your observation's exactly right, that the National Treasury does have intelligent, smart, well-trained individuals, and they and there's a sense at which the bureaucracy exercises a level of independence from the political authority. Now, people in the financial press will extol that as a virtue, right? I think that's fundamentally undemocratic, right? And that's why I say substantially and procedurally, because if we look at some of what's happened procedurally, some of that starts to actually become more obvious. So if you look at the VAT hike, the way the tax laws have been written is that the VAT hike would have come into effect simply on pronouncement by the Minister of Finance, right? And actually Parliament, without passing a revenue bill, which normally only does in September, later in the year, couldn't actually stop that, right? It took the court case to actually legally halt it. Okay, it seemed like we were all going to go along with the fact that it was now cancelled, right? Even if legally it was still should have gone ahead. But National Treasury has constructed the budget architecture, the whole flow of the processes to provide a level of participation and transparency, but at the same time to retain power and actual control with its own processes, right? So you see that now with SASSA, who's the agency delegated with administering social grants. And SASSA's had conditions attached to its budget that it must now implement various procedures which are used on the social relief of distress grant to exclude recipients. So a biometric checks, bank verifications, these big data sort of tools to try and exclude and limit the number of applicants. And the National Treasury has said, as a condition to SASSA's operating budget, you have to go and implement these same tools. Now that's social grant policy, right? That's National Treasury that's complete overreach, right? They should not be dictating to SASSA how social grant policy gets implemented. But on a consistent basis, they make use of the budget infrastructure and architecture, yes, to allow a veneer of engagement and transparency, but actually to wield enormous power, right? And the bureaucracy itself often holds that. And as you say, we've witnessed this sort of divergence now in language. But if you read what the ANC is saying, the ANC is saying we should have a proper budget which is aimed at transforming our economy, etc. And we shouldn't resort to austerity. And National Treasury saying we have a 75 billion rand hole and we're going to have budget cuts, right?
Yeah.
And this speaks to the minister's unwillingness or inability to align the bureaucracy of which he's ultimately oversees with what his party I think he's also using that strategically because he's not fully aligned with his own party.
On austerity, the IEJ recently said, in light of the revenue options available to National Treasury, a return to austerity would be a political choice rather than a necessity. And there's been some concern in various quarters that this VAT crisis will allow Treasury or give Treasury the excuse to go back to implementing austerity. Why are you concerned about that?
I mean, I think there's a high likelihood that's what we'll see in this next budget, right? National Treasury says there's a 75 billion rand hole.
Yeah.
Okay. That hole, if we were to understand it, which is worth just starting at the technicalities, is probably only about 60 billion. Okay. Because if you remove the increased zero rating, which was supposed to make up for the VAT increase,
sure.
And if you take account of the almost 10 billion in tax overrun, which we had, you're left with about 60 billion. Of that, only 2.7 billion is actually a shortfall in this immediate financial year, right? So that, and of course, we still need to find all of it in this budget. Each budget does have a 3-year a time frame, but it does indicate that we could plug this year's gap pretty easily, which would allow us more time to explore what the options are for the medium term.
Sure.
What we mean more directly in that statement is that there are other sources of funds. This narrative that the VAT was is the only option, and without that we must cut doctors, cut nurses, cut schools, cut social grants, is a misleading narrative. And we've identified over 100 billion in available resources. Of course, you've got to have the will to there are trade-offs with those, and you've got to have the will to implement them.
In terms of austerity, I think one of the big worries or fears is that grants, or at least the SRD grant, could be sacrificed, if not this year, then in the medium term. You've done a lot of work, not only on these grants, but on the need to actually expand the social security system. Are you worried about a potential slashing of grants? Sam, before we get back to the episode, we just want to let you know we have a big goal on this channel to build this community to 1,000 members. That means we have 2 new levels of SMWX membership. The first level gives you exclusive access to content, discounts on merch, but the second level, in addition to various other perks, gives you access to me. We're going to have meetups, online sessions. You're going to get discount on our live events. So if you want to deepen your SMWX community experience, help us get to that 1,000 member level. Look forward to seeing you there.
The SRD grant remains in National Treasury's crosshairs, right? It's not a grant that they've ever wanted. It's not a grant that they like. It's a grant that they argue is too untargeted, creates dependencies and lowers incentives to work, and is essentially wasteful expenditure. I believe we've put out very robust research which shows the use of that grant in firstly staving off destitution, but also in small business usage, in education, in jobs seeking. So there's a whole range of ways in which a grant like that is very functional for the economy. But it remains under fire. It's in the budget in the previous budgets in February and April. It was there only for the first year, and then for the outer years it was there as a provisional allocation, right? Indicating the hesitancy towards funding this. But I think that National Treasury also knows that certain pockets of expenditure have very sort of tight interest groups around them, and that radically sort of like slashing social grants is a bad look for the ANC-led government, and
to say the least.
Yeah, and is quite difficult, which is why I think this conditions attached to the SASSA budget, which I mentioned earlier, is really worth us paying attention to, because what that is, I mean, we estimate that these mechanisms, the fact that you can only apply online for the SRD, that now you have to do a biometric verification, so they send a link to your smartphone, and you have to then hold it up and fingerprint and take a photograph. So you need to have a smartphone on the same number which you originally applied for. That they then run a test each month to look at how much is in your bank account, and if what's in your account, whether that's money for your aunt or your cousin, or if that's is child support payments, or if that's a gift, or if that's any other myriad of non-income sources, right?
Sure.
And you're excluded on the basis of that amount being above the means test. So these digitally driven exclusion tools, and the fact that they are now looking to attach those to the other grants is a way of National Treasury saying, we're not shutting down grants. We are going to make sure that they targeted to the poorest by having a lower means test, and we're going to make sure on the relatively small number of fraudulent grants, we're going to implement all of these mechanisms which actually serve to exclude about half of eligible SRD grant recipients, because that's a more fair and transparent system, more robust sorts of checks. And it appears to me that they're going to use that as the avenue to try and cut down on the social grant envelope.
One other thing the Treasury says is, well, we would love to be able to spend more on social services, but if we can't raise tax, then we would have to increase debt, and debt is seen as this bad thing. You've done some work looking into debt, and what you've said is that it's not so much about the quantum of the debt, but it's about the cost of the debt. Can you help us understand that?
Sure. So let's look at both of those revenue sources. Debt first. South Africa, the number that appears most regularly in the news is the ratio of our debt to our economic activity, right?
Sure.
It is debt to GDP, right? And that is approaching around 70%, okay? And that level, that sort of quantum of debt is roughly in line, slightly above the emerging market averages, but it's roughly in line with whether you look at middle income countries, whether you look at emerging markets, developing country averages. That's the realm, okay?
Sure.
For advanced economies, is much higher,
Yeah,
right?
Sure.
And so we're not borrowing, and annually our deficits are also actually of a similar sort of scope, 4-5%, right? So,
Right.
so we're not acquiring borrowing each year or have a debt pool that is an extraordinarily large. The problem is that we are paying about twice as much for that debt as is average in those those categories, right? And so what that means, and National Treasury is right, is there's a legitimate crowding out of other forms of expenditure because we are servicing that debt.
Why is that, by the way? Why are we paying more than the average for our debt?
So, I mean, it's a complex set of like factors. It has to do with the perceived riskiness of a country. Our rating levels impact that. The political uncertainties, perceptions of corruption, things like load shedding. You know, lenders are lending to you on the basis that you'll repay them, and the more nervous they are about being repaid, the higher they will charge, right?
Sure.
But we, on a policy level, also have been very shy to implement policies which would directly attempt to lower that debt cost, right? So prescribed assets, which gets sort of bandied about, but which was used very effectively by the apartheid government, for instance. But essentially, there's huge pools of private sector savings, right, in South Africa, in pension funds, medical schemes, unit trusts, and so on. And you could say that a certain share of those have to be lent to our government at a certain rate, right? And that would make available at a viable rate of return an extremely large pool of borrowing. We could be implementing various controls on the movement of funds, which would lower one's borrowing costs. The Reserve Bank could intervene more in the market for South African bond instruments. The Reserve Bank could also lend to our development finance institutions like the IDC and the Development Bank at a reduced rate. So there are direct policy tools, but which are, interfering with the operations of the financial market, right?
Sure.
Which would lower those debt costs. On the tax side, I don't know if I
sure, absolutely, because we've done austerity or cutting the budget, debt, and of course taxes, the other part of what Treasury has spoken about, and the other part of where we could raise revenue.
Yeah, and I think the pool of funds is not endless, right? There are, at least in my understanding of the economy, constraints on government expenditure.
Sure.
The question is, are there avenues besides for the VAT increase?
Yeah.
In the immediate, there's three in particular I would point to. The first is various tax breaks, which many individuals, wealthy, higher earning individuals and businesses earn. So one example is that those earning above R1 million per year receive about 60 billion in retirement fund rebates. Okay. That's not the element. That's not to say retirement fund contributions are untaxed, right? That this is on top of the untaxed nature of our retirement fund contributions.
Right.
We've fill in how much we have saved each year, and we receive a rebate for a portion of that, right? I would argue, that essentially is a social grant for you and I,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. No biometric test needed.
Yeah, right. File a return, save some money for yourself, for your own retirement, and we'll give you money back, right? So there's 60 billion just for those above R1 million a year, right? We recently lowered corporate income tax rates from 28 to 27%.
And this was supposed to create all kinds of economic dynamism.
Yes, supposed to, it costs that tax rate as the reason why we're not seeing investment, as if our rail, roads, infrastructure, education, corruption, electricity, those things, aren't what's really holding back investment, right? It's this 1 percentage point in the corporate income tax rate, so that's 15 billion. If you just put it back to where it was without even raising it, right?
Yeah, and the sky didn't fall when it was 28. Right?
Yeah. Then you've got 300 billion sitting in the gold and foreign exchange currency reserve account, the GFECTRA, which Treasury's already has used 150 billion out of that, right? So this small gap that we have now, could be so there's immediate options, and then there's more sort of medium term options.
Could I stop you there, because as you're saying that, I'm seeing that. So what's the so-called shortfall, and we need to for this year, right? It's like
2.7 billion. I mean, that can be
so that's done, right?
That's done, right?
But even if we just did one of these things, like let's say we increased corporate tax to 28 just this year, and we got that 15 in, then that would buy us another year to have the deeper conversation about the other stuff that we could reconfigure.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Right.
And that other stuff, I think, we have to look at the under taxation of wealth in South Africa, which historically was accumulated by white people like my family, on the backs of the inequitable system that we had.
Sure.
We haven't got any net wealth tax, and we undertax income from wealth. So when you make income in the form of dividends or a
capital
inheritance
gains,
or capital gains, that is taxed at a lower rate than when you make income from work, right? So my dividend income from owning shares in X business is tax less than my salary, right?
Yeah.
So there's a systemic under taxing of wealth. There's a need to look at a resource rent tax, which is a special kind of a tax in commodity boom periods. Potentially land tax, potentially maybe on unused land that's being held for speculative gain, and then there might be room within the both personal income tax and corporate income tax for areas of increase. And what the conversation really needs to be had is like, are those worse than people starving, right? Because that's like, I mean, that's what it means to cut social grants, for instance. But beyond that role of the budget in ameliorating destitution, it's also about, using the budget as a proactive tool in that restructuring of the economy, which we could speak more about, but and how that's also undermined if revenue's insufficient.
Well, one thing that interests me and that we've heard quite a lot on this channel and maybe not so much on mainstream media is that a series of economists have been arguing, and I see that you also I think you published a paper in 2020 about this. Far from cutting spending, we should actually be expanding spending in a massive fiscal stimulus to dig us out of this economic hole that we're in. And we don't see any of this language coming out of Treasury. Funnily enough, not a lot of this language even coming out of political parties who would place themselves at least on the center left, ANC, EFF, MK. None of them really seem to be talking about a big stimulus. I mean, why should we be putting more into the economy when Treasury is telling us that we don't have enough?
So I haven't. In general, that's a view I support. I haven't used the language of the stimulus really recently, on purpose, in part because I think that there's a step before that. It's not simply about the kind of quantum, because we could badly spend.
Well, we kind of have been,
right? Okay. It would be
that experiment has been run,
right? And I mean, most money spent in the economy is going to have some positive benefit, right? Because once you start spending, it goes into the households and businesses and so on. But we could spend that badly, right? So what I think we need first is a reorientation of macroeconomic and fiscal policy as a transformative tool. Okay, so what do I mean by that? Well, let's start with what's the objective, what's the purpose of this policy. So in my mind, what we need to, as a country, across policy do is say, we aren't making enough goods and services. We are going to identify a set of sectors where we think in an internationally competitive way we can really grow that set of sectors, right? And we are going to then orientate all policy around that. So our development finance institutions are going to like lend big to those sectors. Our trade policy is going to shield those. Our industrial policy is going to have incentives for those. Our education policy is going to have the right skills for those like sectors. And
infrastructure would be built around.
Exactly, right. Infrastructure will make sure that we're not just about getting coal to an export port, but servicing these other like sectors and so on, right? So there has to be an orientation of economic policy and policy as a whole around the objectives of growing a particular set of like sectors.
Do you think? Sorry, but this is already quite interesting. Do you have any sectors in mind that could work, in the South African economic milieu?
Yes. So I what a lot of the like literature has argued is that manufacturing in particular plays a dynamic role because it has linkages with the most other number of sectors, because it has these spin-off benefits, skills development, and so on. Although there are some service sectors which I think are important also. But South Africa, and we identified some of these in the master plan process. So if you look at agro-processing, okay, we have a good agricultural sector, but we could be refining and processing those agricultural items more and exporting food goods that have gone through some level of agro-processing. That's generally quite labor intensive.
Great.
Also needs quite a bit of land, which we have, and it has other reasons why that's just like suitable. Okay, on the agricultural side, probably in cannabis, and there's some other areas there. Then we need to look at in manufacturing, look at downstream the minerals beneficiation, right? So what is it which a platinum gets used for in the renewable energy? Okay, that's hydrogen fuel cells, right? So there's a way of sort of analyzing where it is which we have we're not going to start off with an absolute advantage in anything, right?
Yeah, sure.
So we have to create that advantages, which is based on a initial assessment that our endowments are like favorable for that. And then fiscal policy and macro policy has to come in as a supportive element of that, right?
Right.
So expenditure then would be orientated towards the kinds of infrastructure which we need to export those goods, or it would invest in skills and education needed in those sectors. Other macro policy tools, exchange rates and like so on, could allocate funds in the economy or direct funds in the economy in a way that sees the expansion of those sectors. So what you're really trying to do is three things. Firstly, use macro and fiscal policy to expand supply, right? So that more's being made. Secondly, to expand demand for those goods. So in the first instance, government's going to have to offer to purchase those items or other like mechanisms for ensuring increased demand. And lastly, you're then orientating that policy towards the structural transformation of the economy.
Right.
At the same time, this does have to come along with fiscal policy that's aimed at ameliorating destitution, right?
Sure.
So that's where like social grants and other, health and education, care services, and so on. That there's very real human needs in our society, and that can be done in a way which is reinforcing to these economic development goals, which you have, but is also independent of those. That's a sort of moral imperative. And if we do that, and we look and we say, right, actually the amount of money which we've got is enough to, if it's spent right, to achieve this expansion of the economy where we needed and this reorientation, then I'm fine with us spending just the same amount that we spent last year, right?
Sure.
There is no sort of value in and of itself of spending more, right? But of course, if we look and we see that we can only achieve this kind of restructuring with larger incentives and so on, then we need to spend more. And what I've put forward is not really controversial if you look at the history of economic development. I mean, China is not the leader in renewable energy goods because it sat back and said, well, maybe the Chinese free market will
exactly.
sort of one day invest in those things.
Yeah.
There was a policy decision that this is a sector which we are going to become the world leaders in, and we're not China, right? And there's various differences, but I mean those type of policy decisions have been made time and time again over the last 200 years, and so we need to make those choices and then allocate enough resources to see that through.
Yeah. As we close, just some deeper questions about the economy. I mean, one aspect of your work that I'm interested in is the way that you've been able to show how our economy is still very concentrated in terms of the wealth in the economy. So even though it looks like we've got all these different firms doing all these different things, when you really trace back the ownership of these firms to, the holding companies, we've made very little staggeringly little progress in 30 years to actually diversifying the economy. It may be more fragmented, and you can't see, that you have like an Anglo-Val and then an Anglo-American, but really wealth is still very concentrated when you trace it all the way back.
So the economy has diversified to an extent, right? Particularly in the service sector, particularly in telecoms and in big retail, right? Although there the tendency towards like monopolistic practices, as we all know from our data charges, has been carried through into those sectors.
Right. Right.
But certainly in sort of manufacturing sectors, there hasn't been the kind of diversification which the economy really needs, and there hasn't been a diversification of economic sort of power either, right? So yes, mining occupies a smaller share of the economy than it used to, and elements like that. But then if you look at the top 40, you see that it's still mining, it's still finance, it's now big retail, it is big telecoms, but it's also mining linked heavy industry, and so those who dominate big business and therefore exercise influence over economic policy have seen much more continuity in the sort of mining, heavy industry, and sort of finance sectors than the statistics of the economy as a whole would indicate. And with that, the concentration of wealth, is in our economy, as you said, still extremely concentrated.
So one last question on this budget thing to kind of tie a bow on this and come back to where we started. This is just a worry of mine, which I'll put to you, and you may agree or disagree, but there's this assumption that because we've resolved the VAT issue, we've resolved the budget issue. And I'm really worried. I'm really worried that Minister Godongwana, if he gets to the point, let's hope, of tabling his budget, is just going to open a whole other can of worms, which could be about grants, could be about taxes. And there's really no confidence that we can have that this budget is going to be agreed to by the number of political parties we need to actually see it through. And so, budget 3.0 may hopefully it sails through. But if it doesn't, I just worry that we really would enter like a new level of crisis. And I wonder what you make of that.
I think I think that is quite possible. Okay. There's a part of me, listen, it would be a crisis. There are mechanisms for departments to continue to access funds even without a budget passed. But of course, the inability for the government to pass a budget, and if we reached a point where we ran out of all of the leeway, that would be a serious crisis. But I think that the kind of contestation which we've witnessed around the budget is actually a good thing, right? If the finance minister comes back now and his solution is, instead of the VAT increase, he's going to cut on social grants, education, health, infrastructure spending, the things that we need, I hope that the parties who were behind the VAT the retraction of the VAT increase do vote that budget down, and it is not passed, right? Because that's what their public statements say, right? Their statements, with notable exception of the EFF, don't go into how the alternative revenue should be raised. Only the EFF has, but they have, quite clearly said that their expectation is not budget cuts, but alternative revenue. And if the minister fails at that, they should send him packing, and that would be destabilizing in the short term. But for our democratic project and for the reorientation of fiscal policy in the medium term, I would welcome that.
Well, Gilaad Isaacs, thank you for sharing your insights. Keep doing the excellent work that you do, and maybe we'll have to have you back once this budget is actually tabled.
Excellent. Thanks so much. You too, Cesar.
Like, share, subscribe. Thank you for watching. Help get us to our next milestone of 250,000 subscribers. Comment down below with your thoughts and keep it locked on SMWX. Ayeye.